So I apologize in advance if anyone has trouble understanding me. I asked if we could get subtitles, but we can't. Apparently there's no technology to translate the Irish accent. So I'll just start. In case anyone's never heard of him, Aleister Crowley was an English poet. He was born in 1875 to a wealthy family who were members of the Plymouth Brethren, a particularly conservative Christian group. Crowley's upbringing was so religious and so strict that as a child his only reading material was the King James Bible. By the time he reached adolescence, however, Crowley had come to despise the religious and moral hypocrisy of his family and began rebelling against their fundamentalist values. Although Crowley went on to achieve some fame as a poet and mountaineer, he is mainly remembered today as the most infamous mystic, magician, and occultist of the 20th century. And Crowley acquired his notoriety primarily because of his criticism of organized religion, his very open and libertarian stance on sexuality and drug use, and his tendency to write frankly and unapologetically about these topics. And he also considered himself a prophet, and at the beginning of the 20th century he founded a new religious movement called Thelema. Crowley claimed that in 1904 he received a religious revelation in the form of an inspired text known as the Book of the Law. The Book of the Law proclaims the beginning of a new religious paradigm for mankind and announces the law of Thelema. The principal tenets of Thelema are: every man and every woman is a star, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, love is the law, love under will, and there is no law beyond do what thou wilt. And Crowley interpreted the law of Thelema to mean that every individual is intrinsically divine, and as such, each individual has a divine right to pursue their own personal path through life. For Crowley, the point of life is for each person to discover and fulfill their unique purpose in the universe, which he called accomplishing their true will. He equated discovering your true will with activating your own personal genius and realizing your own divinity. For Crowley, transforming consciousness was the key to activating your own genius, particularly transforming consciousness such that you dissolve the boundary between the ego and the non-ego, which he equated with a mystical or religious experience. And these experiences are the goal of Crowley's system of practical occultism. The motto of his system is the method of science, the aim of religion. And this means marrying scientific experimental methodologies to religious practices in order to understand the physiological and psychological processes that produce mystical experiences and to reap the benefits of these experiences. So Crowley would have been extremely interested in the scientific research into the production of mystical experiences that many people here are actually currently researching. Crowley recommended two techniques to transform consciousness. The first is the Eastern discipline of yogic meditation, which he learned in Ceylon and India. And Crowley depicted yoga as an introverted method of transforming consciousness, in which the mind is contracted to a single point until normal consciousness is transcended. The second technique is Western ceremonial magic, or magic with a K as Crowley spelled it, which he learned while he was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn was a magical secret society founded towards the end of the 19th century that instructed its members in the theory and practice of ceremonial magic. Essentially, it was like a Hogwarts school of witchcraft and wizardry for wealthy Victorians. Crowley depicted ceremonial magic as an extroverted method of transforming consciousness, in which the magician's consciousness is ritually exalted by words, symbols, instruments, and gestures until normal consciousness is transcended. And Crowley also postulated an intrinsic and essential connection between sex, drugs, and religion. For him, the bliss of sex and the intoxicating effects of drugs are analogous to the blissful intoxications of consciousness that accompany religious experiences. And Crowley combined his own meditative and magical practices with a wide variety of drugs, including hashish, cocaine, heroin, morphine, ether, chloroform, and peyote. However, Crowley's practice of ritualistically combining sex and drugs for religious purposes basically earned him a sinister reputation as a black magician. Although he died in relative obscurity at the age of 72 in 1947, Crowley became something of an icon during the 1960s. His philosophy of love and freedom, his progressive views about sexuality and drug use, his interest in exotic spiritual practices were all very much in tune with the atmosphere of the psychedelic 60s. The Beatles, for example, included Crowley's face on the famous cover of their Sgt. Pepper's album. And Dr. Timothy Leary sometimes said that he saw his own work as a continuation of Crowley's. Although it's been known for a long time that Crowley experimented with peyote, the subject was never very deeply researched, and the purpose of my thesis was to flesh out the story of Crowley's relationship with peyote. I'll now present a summary of my findings. I'll first point out that some sources say that Crowley experimented with mescaline, and this is not entirely true. I found no evidence that he ever experimented with pure mescaline. Crowley experimented with peyote buttons and then later with a fluid extract that was commercially available, a fluid extract of peyote. And both of these contain a number of alkaloids in addition to mescaline. Crowley first encountered peyote buttons on a trip to Mexico in 1900. And I've suggested that some of his writings contain allusions to a tribal peyote ceremony, possibly of the Huichol people. If Crowley used peyote in a tribal ceremony in 1900, then he was one of the first non-natives to do so. 7 years later, Crowley began experimenting with a fluid extract of peyote produced by the Park Davis Company. Crowley used the Park Davis extract in his ceremonies for more than a decade, which means he was probably the first European to ever develop a personal entheogenic practice with peyote. His diaries of 1907 record his first experiments with the extract when he's trying to discover a psychedelic dosage of the drug. The results of these experiments were underwhelming, but at some point in 1908, he actually discovered a psychedelic dosage, and he wrote about his experiences in a semi-autobiographical short story called The Drug, which was published anonymously in 1909. Peyote is not explicitly named in the text, it's just called the drug that giveth strange vision. But the experience described bears all the hallmarks of a classic entheogenic experience. The narrator is awestruck by the beauty and intensity of the peyote visions, and he struggles with the question of whether or not he's actually gone insane. And in the end, he emerges from his trip transformed as if he has gone through a spiritual death and rebirth experience. Now, the drug was not the first description of a peyote experience to be published, but it seems to be the first to focus almost entirely upon the spiritual significance of peyote experiences. Most early descriptions of peyote experiences focused on the physiological and visual effects produced by the drug. Now, given what we know about the impact of set and setting, this isn't a surprise. Most early experimenters were pharmacologists, toxicologists, and ethnographers whose intention was to analyze the symptoms of peyote intoxication. Whereas Crowley, on the other hand, had a deeply religious mindset that was ingrained in him since he was a child, and this later grew into a mystical and magical worldview that he acquired through his study of meditation and occultism. So Crowley's mindset, combined with the setting of his rituals of ceremonial magic, are precisely the conditions you would expect to lead to profound spiritual transformations through the use of a classical psychedelic. Hence, Crowley is one of the first Westerners to truly appreciate the religious dimension of psychedelic experiences. And his writings about ceremonial drug use demonstrate a definite awareness of the significance of set and setting. So it makes sense that Timothy Leary saw his own work as a continuation of Crowley's. After his early personal experiments, Crowley began introducing other people to the use of peyote, as many as 100 people by his own count. At first, this was limited to his magical students, who were members of his own secret society. However, he soon began introducing peyote to people outside his magical group. For example, in 1910, Crowley and his students performed a semi-public magical ceremony to an invited audience that included some journalists. The audience were given an intoxicating brew to drink, apparently a mixture of fruit juices infused with fluid extract of peyote and maybe even a twist of opium. Later, during the First World War, Crowley held peyote parties, where many writers, artists, and other bohemians were initiated into the ceremonial use of peyote, such as the New Zealand short story writer Catherine Mansfield and the American novelist Theodore Dreiser. Apparently, Dreiser became afraid after he drank his first dose of peyote, and he asked Crowley if there was a good doctor nearby in case anything went wrong. Crowley replied they didn't know about a good doctor, but there was definitely a top-class undertaker just down the street. Dreiser wasn't impressed. So Crowley can be credited with introducing the ancient practice of using peyote as an entheogenic sacrament to many Westerners between 1910 and 1917. It's even possible that Crowley discussed peyote with the English novelist Aldous Huxley when they met several times in Berlin in 1930. Now, this was more than 20 years before Huxley published The Doors of Perception, that classic account of his mescaline experience that introduced psychedelic spirituality to a wide audience of intellectuals and artists. But even if Crowley did not introduce Huxley to peyote, he was formulating almost identical ideas about psychedelic mysticism nearly 50 years before Crowley, or before Huxley. On a few occasions, Crowley used peyote during magical ceremonies intended to advance his own spiritual attainment and to develop further the religion of Thelema. At these times, he retired to a desert or to an uninhabited island and would return only after he experienced visions that he felt confirmed his spiritual evolution. Crowley also used peyote in a number of ceremonies intended to achieve visionary contact with spiritual entities or autonomous intelligences that he described as beyond human. He said that these entities possessed knowledge. He said that these entities possessed knowledge and power beyond his own, and they revealed information to him about his destiny and sometimes gave him new magical names. Now, these magical operations are strikingly similar to the tribal custom of vision quests, which are often undertaken at puberty. During a tribal vision quest, a young member of the tribe is sent out alone without food or water into the wilderness and told not to return until they attain visionary contact with their spirit guide. The spirit guide would then give the young candidate a new name and reveal information to them about their destiny. Some tribes also use peyote or other psychoactive plants to facilitate these vision quests. So Crowley's own spiritual retreats, which combined Eastern meditative yoga with Western ceremonial magic and the sacramental use of peyote, should be seen as a truly innovative modern twist on the ancient tribal practice of vision quests. And Crowley actually integrated the content of his peyote visions into the theology of Thelema, the religion that he developed. And in my thesis, I put forward the argument that the writing of the Book of the Law also involved the ceremonial use of peyote. If this is true, and I think it seems very likely, then this means that Thelema is the first non-tribal psychedelic religious movement to be developed in the 20th century. So, to conclude, Aleister Crowley began experimenting with peyote at the beginning of the 20th century and continued for almost 2 decades. He was one of the first non-natives to experience peyote in its native habitat, and the first modern psychonaut to approach psychedelic experiences with a scientific attitude and a religious intention. He introduced around 100 more people to the sacramental use of peyote, and he directly or indirectly influenced a number of key figures in the psychedelic movement of the 1960s. He developed a sophisticated personal entheogenic practice based on the techniques of meditation and ceremonial magic, and he founded what is probably the first non-tribal psychedelic religion of the 20th century. So Aleister Crowley is definitely a true pioneer in the modern history of psychedelic research and entheogenic religion, and he's a worthy subject of study for both researchers and practitioners alike. Thank you for your attention.
You made a very good lecture.
Thank you.